Okay, I think it's all good. I think we can start since it's a cap on how many people can be in the lecture anyways. So welcome everyone to today's lecture. So I'm going to be looking at basically development and also specifically getting castled really early and then what to do if your opponent is lagging behind. So if we have a look at this very first example I've chosen here, I've tried to keep it as simple as possible. And it's black's move. And as we can see, black is already castled the king to the king side. He's fianchettoed the bishop. Everything is looking good in terms of piece development. We just need to get our light squared bishop out. But if we have a look on the other side of the board, white is up a pawn, but his king is still stuck in the center. So in this situation, guys, you can actually take advantage of this by playing disruptive moves. So I'm going to emphasize disruptive moves and tempo gaining moves to try and keep the king locked up so it can't castle safely. So in this position, what you can do as black, this happens in a lot of similar situations as well, is that you can play rook e8 check. And here, in order to block the check, white would have to play the move bishop to to e2. And here, does anyone see a move black can play to try and prevent white from getting the king to safety next move? So there's two possible moves you could play here. One is probably much better than the other one. Yeah, so queen d3 is one of the moves you could play. Any other options? Yeah, so queen e7 is the move I'm looking for. But just to show you what happens after queen d3. So the problem with queen d3 is that, yeah, we are preventing white from getting the king away. But white could play the move knight to f1. And here we're down a pawn. We want to be attacking. We probably don't really want to trade queens. So trading queens would end up badly for us because the king would probably be much safer that way once the queens come off. So instead of trading queens here, I'd probably have to play a move such as knight to b4 to try and keep the queens on, which is actually not a bad move. Knight b4, because if queen takes, then I think you could play knight takes d3, hitting the king and hitting the bishop using this pin. So especially for the people who are um, more beginner to intermediate, pins are going to be like really, really important in a lot of your games. So just keep an eye on these sort of tactics. But a much better move instead of queen d3 is actually just to go queen e7. This keeps the queen away from possible tactics. In order to get castled now, white's going to have to block, because if castles, we just go queen takes e2. And unfortunately, there's no rook e1 pins here because the rook is defended and we just go queen takes. And now the rook can't capture the rook because the queen is pinning. So I have to capture back, and this wouldn't go well for white. Okay, so in this position, white could try the move knight back to f1. And now we want continued disruption. So we want to play moves which cause some problems for our opponent. He's not going to be casting right away, so maybe we have a move here to just develop one of our pieces. There's actually two really interesting moves here for black. See if you can spot one of them. So one move is a little bit easier to find. The other move is extraordinarily difficult, but it's really cool looking move. So if you could spot that move, you get extra points, but it's not easy to spot. It's all about tempo. It's all about attacking. And it's all about bringing your rooks centralized into this open E and D file. So knight h5 is not bad. Knight h5 is okay. Looking to bring the knight into the f4 square. Bishop g4 is not bad. The problem with bishop g4, I think, is that next move white is going to bring the knight into e3. So next move, let's say we play bishop g4, then knight comes to e3 is the problem there. So there are two moves in this position for black, actually. So the first move is knight to e4. And after knight to e4, we're offering a trade of bishops. Let's say bishop takes, king takes. And then if white plays the move knight to e3 now, so black has a very strong move here. And this was the whole point of knight e4. So anyone see the tactic here? To win some material back. Actually, you have two good moves here. You have one move to sort of keep the king stuck in the center a bit longer, but the other move's better because it just wins the pawn back. Knight takes f2. So what we call this is we're just removing the defending piece. So the pawn is defending the knight. So we're removing that defender. We're also forking the queen and the rook. And after king takes, we can just go queen takes on e3. And we have this nice check on the king. The king has to move. We've won the pawn back and the king's still stuck in the center. So it's going to come under a big attack. So we'll just bring the bishop out and the rook will slide across to d8. And this is really nice position for black. The other move, which is really tricky to find, other than knight e4, is the move bishop to h3. This is a really cool looking move. It sacrifices a bishop, it looks like, for no particular reason, because, I mean, white can just take it, right? This is sort of like reminiscence of a move Tal played in one of his really famous poison pawn games, where he played bishop b5 and sacrificed a piece, all for the sake of tempo. So the whole point of the sacrifice is that the bishop attacks that pawn on g2 and it gains a valuable tempo. So when white takes back, black will play the move rook to d8. It's entire piece sacrifice, guys. And the whole point is just to get this rook into d8 with tempo. So a little bit more advanced, but really nice if you can spot it. And after queen c2, for example, knight b4 would be a really strong move because now the queen is out of squares to defend the bishop. So wherever the queen goes, would run into queen takes e2 checkmate. And if knight d2, I think there's going to be some problems after knight to e4, utilizing this pin. And I'll just give you an example of what could possibly happen. Let's say bishop takes, king takes, and now we're threatening to play knight c3. So let's say castles would run into knight c3, forking the king, forking the bishop. So instead, what would happen is maybe white would play rook c1. And here, just an example, we could take here, and knight to d4, hitting the bishop on e2 and winning a piece with an attack as well. Okay, so we can see like basically how dangerous it can be if you just lag too far behind in development. Okay, so let's move on to the next example. So this one, we're going to look from the white side, and again, white is a pawn down. Black has these two passed pawns, and black is very far behind in development. So same sort of thing, we have a lot of central control. We want to go for a pawn break this time. So when the king is in the center like this, you want to open up the center as quickly as you possibly can. So there's only one or two pawn breaks you have in this position, and that's going to be like e5 and d5. In this position, it's going to be d5 because it hits the pawn on e6. But we don't have to play it right away because we have a lot of time. So what you can do is prepare it. So what we can do is play the move rook to d1, preparing this d5 pawn push. So in the game, black played knight to f6. And here, how do we continue our attack? Like, what should we be pushing? We have two pawn pushes here, e5 and d5. Which one is the better one? You can type your answer into the chat. E5 or d5? Yeah, so e5 is much better. So just be careful when you're playing moves such as d5 that your opponent doesn't play a move like this and just blocks up everything. Here it's probably still good for white because you can push the pawn to d6, but just try not to let your opponent close the position up too much. So e5 is really good. In the game, I believe black played the move knight to g4. And then this was an online game. players were about, I think, 1800-ish. H3, knight went to H6, and then white just continued the attack in the center with the move pawn to D5. So there's no need to take this knight because our bishop is quite good. Instead, what we want to do is open up the center here and attack the black king while he's still stuck. And here, I think black just blundered with the move knight to F5, and white continued the attack by taking the pawn on E6, pawn takes, queen takes, the knight went back to E7, and here white is already winning. The easiest way to win this is just to play the move knight to G5, threatening the checkmate on F7, and black continued queen C7, and here there are many ways to win. There are at least 2 or 3. So queen F7 is one way, and then just to pick up the queen. In the game, white went for a different win, which was a little bit nicer. Of course, if you see the nice win, then you should always go for the nice win, as long as you see it. But don't go for it and then lose the game. That's painful way to lose the game. I know because I've done that a few times. So knight d5. The idea is that after queen takes e5, how does white finish the game off, guys? What's the winning move here? What's his plan? Actually has 2 really nice moves here to finish the game off, or win significant material. Yeah, exactly. So there's 2 nice moves. So if you go knight c7, it's just going to repeat probably the same position. But the 2 really nice moves here are knight f6 check. So if queen takes or pawn takes on f6, then you have queen takes d7 checkmate. And if knight takes, then of course we lose the queen. We also get checkmated actually. So knight f6 is probably even better than the other one, which was queen takes e5. This is the other one. This would also get checkmated, but I think the difference here is don't have to actually take. So black could have just played a queen down, but this is also checkmate. Okay. So next example, same thing. So here again, black is sort of lagging behind really far in development. So what you want to do in this position is look for moves which cause some problems on the black side. He's going to play bishop e7 and castles. So we know that. So what we should do here is maybe create a threat or attack something. So the easiest way to disrupt your opponent is to create a threat or attack something which is possibly undefended, and line up your pieces with theirs, especially their king and also their queen. So here white has a very strong move to just create some subtle threats. Also watch out when you're walking into pins. So we want to put our opponent in pins, but we don't want to put ourselves in pins, if that makes sense. So after the move bishop to f4, then black would just go bishop takes c4. And here we can't take the bishop, of course, because our bishop on f4 is hanging. Queen b3. Okay, so queen b3 is a good move because it creates a double threat of possibly taking on e6 and also taking on b7. So that would be perfectly fine. So in the game, white played rook e1, which is also a really good move. So after rook e1, it doesn't look like much, but we have a subtle threat if black, just totally ignores us. Let's say black plays c6. So here white is winning with the move knight takes f7. And now we open up this attack on the e6 bishop because the bishop can't take. So after king takes, we can just go rook takes on e6. And now black is probably going to have to give up the queen. Okay, so after rook e1, we have bishop to e7 instead. So we want to continue the attack. So we keep playing moves which are tempo gaining, which are keeping the initiative and attacking undefended pieces, pawns, and so on. So here we can play the move queen b3, hitting the b7 pawn. Again, we're sort of renewing the threat of knight takes f7 here. So knight takes f7 is again a threat. So after queen b3, black has to defend. So I believe in the game, black played this move, which was inaccuracy, but it's important to know when to recognize inaccuracies and also take advantage of them as well. So this is slightly inaccurate just because I think it gives white some tempo. He probably should have just sacrificed the pawn on b7. So knight takes c4 is a good move. If we go queen takes c4 there, then black's just going to castle away and it wouldn't do much. So after knight takes c4, we have an attack on the queen. Obviously, the queen can't go to b4 to trade queens because we just take it and the bishop is pinned. So in the game, black played the move queen to d5 instead. So after the move queen to d5, again, we want to gain some more tempo. So in the game, white played the move knight to c3. The queen went back. And now, how do we continue now? We have two good moves here for white, actually, that win some material. But one's probably by far the better one. Yeah, knight e5 is the best one. So knight a5 would hit the queen and the pawn, but the knight's a little bit offsided there. Whereas knight e5 hits the pawn on f7 and the queen is hitting the pawn on b7. So this is by far the best move. So queen e6 was played. Queen takes b7, of course. So we just take that pawn. And okay, the rest of the game, obviously, black is completely lost, but I'll just point out a few things at the end, mainly for um, beginner to intermediate. Just so the game went something like this: queen c6, bishop d6. Okay, so this is more for, let's say, 1,000 and lower. Is that you want to be careful when you're winning, especially when you're winning. The hardest part is to actually convert, and you want to be on the lookout for tactics all the time, and you don't want to relax. So the worst thing you can do is let your opponent back into a game which you have already worked so hard to win. So there's no need to allow any unnecessary tricks here. So yes, you do want to trade pieces. So knight takes d7 looks like a very natural response, but already it runs into some serious problems apart from the fact that the rook is hanging, and that's checkmate in one. So you can't play knight takes d7. Also, you can't move the knight. So you can't play the move knight to f3, which defends the rook and attacks the queen. Looks like a good move, but runs into a few problems as well. So what's the problem with knight f3? Yeah, bishop takes h2, and that would be a bad way to, lose a game. If you've worked that hard to win the rook, you've done everything right, and then you blunder to a silly tactic and let your opponent back into the game. So you want to be extra careful. So I always say when you're winning, I like to be a little bit more pessimistic. When the position is relatively balanced or I am losing, actually, I like to be very, very optimistic in those instances. But just when I'm winning, just when I know I'm winning, I don't want to stuff it up. So I like to think of worst case scenarios that could possibly happen to me, and I try to stop before it ever comes into fruition. But okay, as long as you're a little bit careful, you shouldn't make any of these mistakes. So let's move on to the next one. So this one's all about tempo. So this position. So I'll give you an example. Let's say rook e1, bishop e7. Okay, so this looks like it's virtually impossible for white to do anything, but it's a very typical Catalan position. We have a very good strong pawn center. This bishop on this long diagonal is very good. Our dark square bishop can also be very effective. And I'll show you that just because black is one move away and it looks like everything's going to be safe, it doesn't mean that he'll get that extra one move to get the king castled. As long as white plays very, very actively and continuously plays moves which are pestering your opponent. So what you want to do is play tempo moves and attacking moves which will maintain your initiative. So let's go move by move. So we have a lot of tempo moves here, by the way. So let's start with one tempo move. So we have e4. That's the first one we have. So e4 is fine. So we're hitting the bishop with tempo. The bishop goes back to g6. So what's another tempo move there? So we have queen a4 and bishop f4. So both good tempo moves. So queen a4 would attack the pawn. Bishop f4 would attack the rook. So okay, I'm going to go with bishop f4 because it develops a minor piece before you develop your queen. So that would hit the rook. So the rook would have to move, let's say, to c8. And now what? Rook b1 is a good move, yes. So we could play rook b1, definitely. That would hit the pawn on b7. So if black castles now, he's going to have to sacrifice that pawn on b7. So he doesn't want to do that. So if he plays knight b6 here, I think we can also chase the knight away here. Probably with the move a4 and then a5. And this would continue disrupting black's plans. Would have to defend somehow the b7 pawn and then move the knight away. And then maybe we can bring the queen to b3 later as well. And queen d7 here would be met by possibly knight e5. Maybe knight e5. And then we could even sacrifice that a4 pawn. Possibly something like this. And then something like this. And where we get a really active rook on the 7th rank. This might work out quite well for us. We could even push the pawn to d5. Let's say something like this. We could maybe play the pawn to d5 and get a passed d pawn. The knight might come to the c6 square next. So after black moves, the knight might hop into c6. We're also capturing this a7 pawn. So this looks very reasonable. Also, we're attacking the bishop on e7 still. So you can temporarily sacrifice some material just to get active pieces. That's also a good way to play in the opening. Could also just push the pawn up the board, perhaps. And yeah, if black ever takes this pawn on d4, I feel like white would just take back, and then white has a very strong pawn center anyway, so I don't think it really affects us. So b6 instead. So after b6, what do we do now? Well, we could continue with the other move suggested, which was the move queen to a4. Yep, excellent move, queen to a4. So attacking the pawn on a7 now. So we're trying to create as many problems as we can. And here probably it was the last chance for black. Should have just castled in the game and then sacrificed the a7 pawn. That would have been the best way to continue. So always look for your chances to get the king away. And after queen takes a7, I think black can still go rook across and then still gets a lot of activity. Will win the pawn back. White still definitely has an advantage here because after the queen moves, we also have the move bishop to c7 coming. So we're probably going to win the b pawn, and also we can put a rook lining up on the d file. So remember, if your opponent allows you to, then sometimes you can line one of your pieces up with, say, the queen or the king, the rook up, and that would allow you to play some tactics later on. So possibly. Or we could even go d5 here. That might be an option as well. And then later bring the rook to d1. But in the game that didn't happen, black played the move pawn to a5 instead, and now it starts to go really, really badly. So what should we play here for white? So knight is pinned, correct? So when we have a pinned piece, what do you want to do? You want to apply maximum pressure to the pinned piece. So the correct move here should be to play the move knight to e5, I think. It also comes with a threat of knight takes, queen takes, queen takes, and then we're just going to pick up the pawn on b6. So if your move comes with a threat, it's even better. We're also threatening the move knight to c6. So let's say some random move, knight c6, would also trap the queen and force black to sacrifice the rook for the knight. Okay, so I think in the game, black couldn't actually stop it, and then the king again was stuck in the center. Already, I mean, I don't see a move for black actually. It's virtually impossible to find a good move for black. So I think this was played. But now after the move f6, we can just take the knight, we can take the bishop even. It doesn't matter, I'll play knight c6 like I said before, and it's winning. Because after rook takes, just exchange up for white with a big attack as well. Okay, so I think the main takeaway for this position was probably tempo. So it looks virtually impossible for white to do anything, but he just played, I mean, sensible tempo gaining moves, keeping the initiative going, and the attack just got bigger and bigger and snowballed into something as we see now where white is virtually just completely winning. Okay, so let's move on to the next position. So this one comes from a French defense. So in this one, it's more about bishop pair. So in this particular case, I'm playing white. I went for knight a4, attacking the queen and attacking the bishop. So bishop pair is really important when you're attacking and also when you're defending. So try to utilize your bishops, especially if you have both of them still on the board. So here, black has the choice of giving up the dark squared bishop or the light squared bishop. In the game, black decided to give up the light squared bishop with bishop takes, queen takes. So we have a pin here on the knight on d7. Knight e7 was played, and here we want to continue our attack. So we're already castled. We have a very nice pin here on the knight. So we want to apply pressure onto the pinned piece. So we're looking at moves such as rook d1 and bishop to b5. But I think bishop b5 is better move just because it doesn't hang the pawn on f2. So just make sure your rook here on f1 is defending this pawn. So we started with the move bishop to b5, attacking the knight, knight c6. And this is sort of the time where people go wrong, because we want to keep the initiative going here. So time is really important, and you don't want to play okay looking moves such as bishop f4. So these moves are okay, you're developing a piece, but the problem is once black gets castled, then it's going to be much harder for you to attack. And then black's going to slowly untangle his pieces and finish his development, and everything should be fine for him. So you want to use this move here to be as active as possible. And white has a really strong move here, and that is the move pawn to b4. Very good. So pawn to b4. So similar to what we talked before, so it's all about tempo. So we only have one move to make use of things, so we want to keep attacking, keeping that initiative going, attacking the bishop, knight takes, we have bishop takes knight. And what happens if bishop takes? So white to play and win a piece. Yeah, I think bishop d4 is probably the best move for black, maybe. Or dropping the bishop back to e7 is also okay. So here what you can do is just play bishop takes, pawn takes, and then rook b1. And here we set up this pin on the b file. We're also threatening to play the move pawn to a3. So for example, a5, a3. I think this would pick up the bishop on b4. So in the game, black dropped the bishop back. And then after bishop e7, we want to keep the initiative going. So what we do now is go bishop to e3. The queen had to drop back to c7. Again, so we have a pin here. So we want to apply a maximum pressure to the pin piece, which is the knight. So rook a to c1. So we want to keep our f rook, maybe to bring it to d1 instead. So rook a c1, black played the move rook c8 to defend the knight. And here we get a situation where you have to make a decision whether you want to keep the attack going or you just want to pick up some material. So it might be tempting to pick up the material here on a7, or you could keep the attack going with a move such as knight to d4. So I chose to keep the attack going with the move knight to d4 instead, attacking the knight on c6. So here, I don't think black can take on e5. So why can't black take on e5? Yeah, if you took on a7 with the bishop, yeah, black would have. Oh no, black doesn't have rook a8, does he? But in this position, I think you might have the move pawn to f4, right? Or even bishop f4 looks interesting as well. That's right, that would put black into two separate pins. But it gets a little bit complicated after bishop f4. What happens after bishop f4, knight f3, for example? Oh, it's probably still fine, actually, because I just take here, queen takes, and worst case, I can always just take the knight. Oh, but then black will get castled, because takes take castled. You'll still pick up all the pawns, so it should be fine. I mean, you'll pick up the pawn on a7. So it'll be 2 pawns up, but or 2 connected pass pawns on the queen side, but that's not what we wanted. But I sort of like f4. If f4 works, then I'd go for f4. Yeah, I sort of like this a bit more, I think. Because knight g4 is the only move I'd be afraid of, but it doesn't seem to work. So I think you just take on c6, and there must be like heaps of good discovered checks coming. Okay. So after knight d4, knight b8 was played. It's a bit more passive move. So here you can actually take on a7, I think. But then black will take on b4. So if you take on a7, black takes on b4. I think maybe this is okay for black. So instead went for bishop takes. So if knight takes, we have the move pawn to b5, utilizing this pin again. So instead pawn takes was played. And in this position, white has a really good move to keep the initiative going again. See if you can spot it. b5 is okay. So I think that the idea with b5 is that black might... Can black play c5 here? Then you play b6, queen d7. Probably this is winning for white as well. Probably, yeah. Because you can trade queens and then probably just take the pawn on a7. Or take an a7 right away as well. Looks quite strong. So in the game, white went for this instead. Knight b5. So if pawn takes knight, then we have rook takes queen, take rook, and white is winning. So black played this. Knight takes a7 was played. Black played bishop here. Of course, we don't want to get checkmated here, so we play the move pawn to g3. Also threatening bishop f4. Rook c7 was played. And here white played bishop to b6. So instead of taking the pawn and allowing black to sort of take with the knight and then get castled, we just played bishop b6 instead to keep the king stuck. After the rook went to d7, so here white plays the move knight takes c6, knight takes c6, and queen takes c6, and we see the king is stuck in this pin now. After the king went to e7, white played the move rook to d1. Again, we have this pin, h5. We want to attack the pinned piece. So again, bishop to c5 here for white. And after bishop c5, the game finished after rook d8. Rook takes, and rook d1. So putting pressure on this pin here. So I think this game was more about the two bishops. And again, it was sort of the same theme as the previous ones we looked at. Okay. This one is a lot easier than the previous ones we looked at, but the position is a little bit more messy. So here we can see that white is probably not going to castle, although white can castle if he wants to. It's just that the king is a little bit more open than in the previous positions we looked at. So in this sort of situation, what you want to do as black is obviously you have the two bishops. You want to open up the position as much as you possibly can when you have the two bishops. And here we see that the king is currently stuck in the center. So you want to go for pawn breaks, which are a little bit more centralized. There's also a potential pin here with the move bishop to a5, that's right. But I mean, white can always block the pin with knight to c3. But in this situation here, what you can do is start with a move such as f5 or e5. And I think practically this is a good decision because after e5, we open up the center for our pieces. And this would give us a lot of counterplay. Our bishops would come into the game and so on. So this was a game played with lower rated players, and white went for this pawn on c6. So we can just sacrifice this pawn on a c6 square. and open up the position instead. We don't actually need to defend this, so no need to play moves like rook a6. e5 is a lot stronger. But after bishop d5, we see that black has a lot of initiative already, and it's really hard for white to do anything. I think white went for this exchange sacrifice with bishop takes b5, bishop takes, bishop a5, and then white had to block this pin with knight c3. But I think the bishop here is quite useful, and because of the white king being stuck in the center, I think there wasn't enough counterplay here, and black went on to win this game quite nicely as well. Okay, I'm going to move on to the last two positions because those two are quite challenging and those ones are quite interesting as well. So I'm going to start off with this position here, which came from a game played by Gufeld. And yeah, white found a very nice way here to sort of keep the king stuck. So sometimes you can't always stop your opponent from getting the king to safety, but you can try and get maximum value for it in a position which seems virtually impossible to do so. So f4 is one possible move here for white. In the game, white went for a different type of idea here. I think he went specifically for the d6 pawn. And he was using his knight and his queen. Knight e4. Yeah, knight e4 is a good starting move. So I wonder if I have the game here. I'm going to skip to the game. So Gufeld played the move knight to e4 here. Queen e7 was played, and white played the move queen to a4. This is really a nice idea. I really like this, because if black castles, then what will happen is white will play the move queen to a3. And the whole idea is that this d6 pawn is hard to defend, and the only way to defend here, I believe, is to go knight to c5. But after knight takes c5, pawn takes c5, we've gotten something for it. So we've managed to get this protected passed pawn on d5 now. But black should still go for that casting line. It seems relatively safe. But in the game, black went for f5 instead. And this is where things get really, really interesting. White played the move bishop to f4, hitting the queen on e7. The queen went back to f8 because it's the only square which defends d6. And now white plays a really strong attacking move, just keeping the initiative going. Instead of moving the knight, plays the move pawn to f4. Black played h6, but if he takes the knight in this position, then what would happen is the move pawn takes e5, and now we see opening up of attack on the queen with the rook. We're also threatening to push the pawn to e6 next move, and don't worry about the sacrifice piece because we're definitely going to win that back, and the king is also not going anywhere anytime soon. So h6, bishop h4, pawn takes, rook takes f4, bishop e5 was played, and here white just plays rook f1 and sacrifices the rook. So yeah, this is a really instructive move because this bishop is really important defending piece for black. It defends a lot of these dark squared holes. So what white is saying is that he doesn't want to lose time moving the rook back. He's just going to keep the rook on that square, bring the other rook in, and he's not too concerned about the material if black takes it because, well, black's rooks aren't really doing anything. They're sort of stuck on the sides of the board. So the extra material is sort of irrelevant here. Plus, there's a very strong threat here for white if anyone can spot it. Let's say I play the move rook a7, which doesn't really do anything, but can anyone spot what the threat is for white in this position? Actually, you have two threats. Knight f6 is one of the threats, which is really strong as well. Yeah, that would pick up the knight on d7. So that's one threat. There's also another move which is a strong possible threat. Yeah. So the move I was thinking of was rook takes f5 here. And if queen takes f5, then you have knight takes on d6 and forking the two pieces here. And if pawn takes, you have the move bishop to h5, hitting the king here. And there's nothing to block this diagonal. So there's a couple of ideas there for white in that position. Queen g7 was played, and here white went for the rook sacrifice with rook takes f5. Because again, pawn takes would run into bishop f5 check. In the game, Gufeld took on f5 first, I think, because there's probably no way to stop the check. h5, he went c5, queen h6, bishop g5. So he doesn't even go for the queen. He just sacrifices the piece and keeps playing on. Queen g6. So he wants to go knight takes d6, I believe. But then after knight takes d6, the bishop would just capture. So, of course, I mean, the next move is probably going to be rook takes e5. Okay, no, he goes knight takes e6 first. And then he goes queen e4 check. And then rook takes e5. Okay. So after queen e4 check, he can't block here on e7 because of the mate. So he has to block on e5 instead. It blocks with the knight, loses the queen, by the way. So after this, and the queen is dropping. So it goes with the bishop, bishop d3. So bishop d3 is threatening to go rook takes, knight takes, and then queen takes, and then discovered check on the queen. So he sacrificed a lot of material here, but it seems to work out just because the black rooks are stuck in the corner of the boards, and the black king is still stuck in the center. Queen g7. And now it looks very tempting to play bishop f6 to me, because bishop f6 sort of disrupts the defense of the queen from the bishop. Also, c6 looks like an interesting option. So in the game, c6 was played. Pawn takes, knight c5, rook takes e5, knight e6, bishop c4, queen a7 check, bishop went back. So see, the black king is just still stuck, so we don't really want to trade queens, I would think. So rook takes on e6, adding more fuel. Queen e7, queen g6, and here finally black resigned. So if king f8, we have bishop h6 check, followed by queen g8 mate. And if the king goes this way, I mean, worst case scenario, we can just pick up the queen with bishop g5. So that was a very nice played game by Gufeld. And now we'll move on to the last position. So this one was one played by Kramnik, and one of Kramnik's most famous attacking games. In a position where it looks like black has completely stopped all white's pawn breaks, Kramnik plays the pawn break anyway. So in this position, we have sort of a stonewall structure with the bishop outside the pawn chain. And it looks like everything is stopped, but Kramnik manages to break open anyway the position. So let's have a look at this game. So we'll skip through this part. Yeah, so for games when there's lots of sacrifices like that, I think maybe parts of it is just a lot of good calculation, but then there are parts where you can't calculate all of it, and you just have to sort of rely on your intuition there and just get to a point where you know the attack is probably winning. So in this position here, Kramnik played the move pawn to e4. So move looked like Alexander had already stopped. F takes, and then he played the move knight to g5. So again, just disrupting black's development, puts the knight on pre, using some tactics. So if queen takes g5 here, then the idea is to go knight takes e4. So open up sort of discovered attack on the queen, and then there's going to be bishop g5, I believe, coming as well. So for example, queen e7 is probably bishop g5 here, as well as knight takes d6 and then bishop f4 tactics to come as well. So let's say bishop g5. If knight f6 here, then you could play knight takes d6, queen takes, and bishop f4, picking up the rook. So bishop f7, knight takes e4 was played, so sacrificing the knight just to get the knight into the e6 square here. So pawn takes, we have knight takes e6, bishop takes e6, queen takes e6. So we sacrifice a piece to open up the position in the center. The king is also stuck. We have the bishop pair, so we want to use our light squared bishop here. So rook takes, the king went across. So if the queen exchanges here, we will win the piece back. So let's say bishop e7, we could just take on h6 and play our other rook to e1 and pick up the bishop on e7. Okay, so queen d5. And yeah, black just resigned in this position because I think it's hard to find a defensive move. It's just dropping a lot of material. For example, knight f6 would run into the move rook takes e7 here, and we could even just take here with attack on both knights. That would be winning at least the piece back with a few extra pawns as well. And obviously queen f6 and so on would run into bishop g5 and rook e6 and all sorts of things. Okay, so I think the last two examples were quite nice. Seeing really strong players sort of stick to this type of strategy as well. Although obviously you can see it's much harder to execute and it involves finding some very strong moves sometimes. But yeah, when you're attacking, especially sort of going to push your initiative forward like we saw in these particular games, um, it's hard to sort of break it down to best moves and good moves. I think it depends on the situation. So if the situation requires you to find like the best move, because otherwise you might end up in a difficult spot or you've sacrificed a lot of material, then you need to be like super accurate. But if your position was already really, really good to begin with, like in the girlfriend game, and your attack was sort of pressed forward quite a bit, then you sort of have the freedom to not be as accurate. But okay, I'm happy to sort of take questions for like the remaining session. So I'm just gonna scroll through the questions we have, which I might have missed. If I missed any questions, you can just let me know in the chat, and I'm happy to answer that. So any advice for mid-game strategies? It depends. Like there's so many strategies in the middle game. Like it really depends on what you're sort of needing to work on. But I would say get familiar with the middle game positions you're getting into, and then just practice them a lot to sort of know the plans back to front, so you don't have to spend so much time thinking during your games. Yeah, the thinking process is um, pretty difficult, but usually I think in, at least in longer games, like classical games, in sort of bunches of moves. So in the opening, if you know what you're doing, then you don't really have to spend much time because it's just reciting preparation. Once you get into the middle game, though, that's when you probably need to be spending some time coming up with plans, which, if you're not familiar with, you should be thinking of in terms of candidate moves and then breaking it down into different options. And I usually think in chunks of moves, so maybe a few moves at a time. So once you have a plan, then I usually just stick with that for the next couple of moves until the position changes. So if there's a pawn structure change or something that happens, or the middle game changes structure somehow, then I'd take another think. But otherwise, I sort of just think in groups of plans. Yeah, in terms of chess books, like there's a lot of chess books. Like it depends on like what you want to work on. I think I might do a video on just all my chess book recommendations. But my favorite chess book is probably the Life and Games of Mikhail Tal for attacking chess. But there are plenty of good books. So could you briefly touch on when it's okay to keep the king in the center? I've been playing the Khan Sicilian and having quite a bit of success with delaying it. Yeah, so I've played the Khan Sicilian basically my whole life, and Sicilians in general I've played. It's my favorite opening as black, of course. And if you play the Khan or Sicilians, there are times when you need to delay castling, and sometimes you even push your H pawn up the board and do all sorts of stuff. And yeah, it does break a lot of, I guess, rules. So if people are not familiar with the Khan, it goes something like this. It's just the opening I play myself. And when it comes to sort of delay castling, that's a whole different topic altogether. But yeah, there are situations where you can sort of delay your king. It sort of has to do with whether your opponent's going to be able to attack you or not. I mean, if your opponent is able to open up the center and attack your king, then it's probably not the safest thing to keep your king hovering around in the center of the board for too long. Let's say in this situation, it's probably unlikely that white is going to break open the center anytime soon because he can't get in the move e5. So it might be a little bit safer for you to, let's say, I mean, castles is a very good move here, by the way, but it's very typical in the Khan to sometimes even delay casting, playing moves like g6 or even h5 and just keeping the king in the center. So it really depends on the situation, I would say. Here, black is also maybe threatening to even go queenside, although it's a very complicated position and you don't usually go queenside in Sicilian. It's just very situational. But to answer your question, basically, yeah, it depends if your opponent is able to open up the center. I mean, if your opponent's about to break open the center, then probably you shouldn't keep the king there for too long. So if I change the position a little bit and let's say he brings the rooks to e1 instead, and he's about to play the move pawn to e5. This is a slightly different situation, so you have to be a little bit more careful here as opposed to before, and you can't just hover around in the center forever because you might get hit. So I even believe I've had a game here from the white side which went something similar to this, and then I think I played like this. Knight d5 was played by my opponent, and on the flip side I believe I took here and then played f5, opening up the center. And then the game I played went something like rook takes f5. And obviously black can't castle kingside because he's going to get attacked, and casting queenside runs into problems with rook takes f7. So yeah, it depends. Depends how safe your king is. What's a good opening for black 800 rated? Well, at a lower level, I don't think openings matter too much because I don't think your opponents will be that familiar with any opening theory. So I would just say play anything you're comfortable with and anything you like. As long as you enjoy it, it's probably the most important thing. Maybe go for something relatively simple. I haven't blundered a piece in a while, but it does happen from time to time, of course. Best way to recover, I mean, if you're losing, you know you're going to lose, probably just go like hyper aggressive. So yeah, the best way to come back from a losing position is just to sort of disregard the result. I mean, you have nothing to lose at that point, so just go as aggressive as you possibly can. Who's my favorite chess streamer? My favorite chess streamers, maybe Eric Rosen and maybe Eric Hansen. Eric Hansen has a very similar playing style to me, I find. He actually even plays the Khan as well. But yeah, they both are very similar. Is there a way to trap opponents who copied your moves? I'm pretty sure if you straight up copy your opponent's moves, there's a way to sort of just win. You can look it up on YouTube. I'm sure people have made a video on sort of the forced win there. So Goffin said not to play Sicilian until you are 2000. I disagree. So I think Gotham is talking more about open Sicilian, but what's gonna happen at like a lower level, at least what I find is that people will after e4, c5, they won't play open Sicilians, or if they play open Sicilians, they're not going to be very familiar with it. In fact, they're going to play moves like bishop c4, which is the most common move, and you'll play moves like e6 as black, and already you're not going to get mated on f7. So if you're a beginning chess player, I actually think that playing that is much better than playing e5, where there's going to be all these traps and possible ways to go wrong. So yeah, I disagree on that one. So I totally think go for it. Play Sicilian. Doesn't matter if you're a beginner or not. Actually, it's probably better if you're a beginner. I think. But that's what I think. If you play e5, you might have to learn 20 different gambits that white might chuck at you. You might also get scholars mated. What Sicilians do I recommend for intermediate players? So I find the ones that work well are like the Khan's pretty easy to play. Sveshnikov is quite good at like lower and intermediate because lots of people don't play the main bishop knight to b5 line. So if people aren't going into the main lines, then it's actually quite good. Yeah, so Khan, Sveshnikov. You could even go for like sort of d6 Sicilians as well, but they're a bit more theoretical.